No one reached for their glass. Papers lay untouched. Even the investors had stopped shifting in their chairs. At Boone Industries, strategic meetings were never conversational. They were calibrated. Control always came first. Alaric Boone leaned back slightly, fingers folded, and said, "If we're serious about discipline, we need to stop carrying dead weight." A brief pause followed long enough to make the sentence feel intentional. His eyes moved to me. "Ruby Dean is a useless expense." The words didn't echo. They settled, heavy and final. The way verdicts do. That feeling is terrible. I hope you're still listening so you can share it with me. I wonder what the temperature is where you live if it's cold. Remember to stay warm. By the way, my lucky number is 2. What about yours? Let me know in the comments. For those who don't know, this was a closed-door strategic meeting at Boone Industries. With board members and primary investors present, Alaric Boone was the billionaire founder and chairman, a man whose authority came preloaded with obedience. I was Ruby Dean, chief operations architect, responsible for the systems that kept the company compliant, scalable, and quietly profitable. I was also his daughter-in-law married into the Boone family. Useful until I became inconvenient. To my right sat my husband, Silas Boone, senior vice president by inheritance rather than accomplishment. He didn't look up. His eyes stayed fixed on a spreadsheet. Jaw set, hands still. In that room, silence wasn't neutrality, it was alignment. I closed my laptop calmly, not in protest, just acknowledgement. I watched reactions instead. A board member nodded once, approving. An investor exhaled, relieved. Legal counsel avoided eye contact altogether. Alaric continued, speaking about efficiency and accountability, never repeating my name, as if the damage was already complete. I had earned my position by building the operational backbone Alaric depended on, and Silas never questioned. Alaric inherited power. Silas inherited cover. I had built leverage, and that was suddenly a problem. As the meeting moved forward, shock cooled into clarity. That sentence wasn't careless. It was positioned, calculated, a public signal wrapped in corporate language. Alaric Boone hadn't lost control. He had chosen his moment and made sure everyone was watching. What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. I kept my expression neutral after the meeting, the kind of calm that convinces people you accepted the verdict. That calm bought me access over the next few days. The temperature shifted. Conversations ended when I joined them. Replies arrived shorter. If they arrived at all, I noticed my name missing from email threads that once required my approval. Then watched decisions move forward without me. Meeting invites changed quietly. Times moved earlier. Rooms moved upstairs. Agendas arrived finalized instead of open. No one explained the adjustments because explanations create records. The company hadn't removed my title yet, but it had begun removing my presence. Silas noticed, or pretended not to. At home, he spoke in soft placeholders. "It's just temporary. You're reading too much into it." He avoided specifics, avoided eye contact, avoided anything that required a position. When I asked direct questions, he answered with tone instead of substance, reassurance instead of facts. I matched his calm. I nodded. I said nothing that could be quoted later. Suspicion works best when it stays quiet. The confirmation came by accident, the way truth often does. I turned a corner near the executive floor and heard Silas's voice before I saw him. He was speaking to someone I couldn't see, low and confident. Nothing like the man at home. "She won't push back," he said. "She never does." After that sentence lodged itself in my head, silence at home stopped feeling accidental. Silas didn't bring it up. He waited, as if the truth might dissolve if left alone. It didn't. He chose a quiet evening to explain, standing across from me like a negotiator, not a husband. The meeting was designed to create pressure. he said. Father needed you off balance. His tone was calm, rehearsed. If you felt exposed, you'd agree to transfer control. Not forever, just enough. I asked when this strategy had been decided. He didn't answer at first. Then he said, after the audit. When the board started asking questions, he paused before adding the phrase that mattered. It's a Boone family decision. Hearing Alaric's words come from Silas's mouth rewired something inside me. That meeting hadn't been about performance or cost. It had been theater, public discomfort, private leverage. I said it out loud, needing to hear it. So the insult was intentional. He nodded once. Pressure works. I walked away before my face could betray me. Every memory began to reorder itself. Invitations that felt mandatory, praise that arrived after agreement, affection that followed compliance. Marriage hadn't been partnership. It had been access. Carefully managed. Silas tried to soften it. This doesn't change how I feel about you, he said. We'll fix it after things stabilize. After Alaric kept his chair. After my usefulness expired. That was the moment disillusionment settled into something sharper. They believed I held shares, titles, voting rights assets that could be surrendered under stress. They thought ownership was power. What I held was dependency. I turned back to him, my voice level. Anger locked down and controlled. You should tell your father, I said. That leverage only works when the other side is trapped. Silas frowned. Confused by my calm, he didn't see it yet. That was fine. I realized then the anger wasn't explosive, but structural. Settling into place with patience, waiting for timing, evidence, and mistakes. Because systems collapse faster when they believe they are still winning in plain sight. The marriage clause had already failed. I didn't confront them after that night. Confrontation creates resistance, and I needed momentum instead. I began working quietly. The way systems respond best, I reviewed access maps, license dependencies, and secondary permissions that no one bothered to track once things were running smoothly. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It thins, one by one. I adjusted parameters I had originally designed for safety. A reporting license here, a regional override there. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible. The system didn't fail. It hesitated. Processes took longer. Approvals stacked up. Costs rose in places executives rarely look until they're forced to. Inside the company, the tone shifted again. Operations blamed vendors. Finance blamed inefficiency. Engineers stayed late, chasing problems that didn't have a single source. I stayed calm, available, helpful. I documented everything and touched nothing directly tied to my name. Alaric noticed before anyone else. He always did. Power makes people sensitive to disruption. During meetings, his patience shortened. Why is this taking so long, he demanded. We didn't have these delays before. He didn't look at me when he asked. He didn't have to. I gave neutral answers. Scale stress, external variance, all true, just incomplete. Silas watched closely now, speaking less, measuring my reactions. I gave him none. The system continued to bleed in controlled amounts. Not enough to trigger alarms. Enough to erode confidence. The board pressed Alaric for solutions. Investors wanted reassurance. He hated that part most. Explaining problems he didn't understand. Then, impatience won. Alaric announced an internal initiative to replace my framework. We don't need dependency, he said sharply. We'll build something cleaner, faster. He called it independence. He called it progress. I listened without comment. They moved fast, cutting corners, rushing timelines, deploying a substitute that looked stable in demonstrations and fragile everywhere else. I recognized the architecture immediately. It was a version I had shelved long ago, flagged as unsafe under scale. I said nothing. Silence was still the better move, because when arrogance replaces caution, the system doesn't need sabotage. It only needs permission to fail exactly as designed. If you agree that quietly pulling access, thinning licenses, and letting the system bleed under its own weight was the right move, Leave a single dot in the comments your voice matters. Because these choices only mean something when people are willing to say they'd make them too. They announced the product on a Monday morning, confident enough to schedule interviews before lunch. Press releases went out first, full of phrases like resilience, innovation, and independence. The market responded exactly as Alaric wanted. Shares steadied. Analysts praised the speed. Inside the building, applause broke out in places where no one had clapped in years. I watched the internal demo from the back of the room. The interface looked polished. The language felt familiar. Too familiar. Within seconds, I recognized the architecture beneath the presentation layer. It was an early build I had shut down myself. Flagged and archived with a simple note not viable under scale. I remembered the simulations, the stress tests, the threshold failures that appeared only when volume spiked. No one asked for my opinion. That, too, was intentional. Alaric stood tall as the engineers explained timelines and projected performance. "We're no longer dependent," he said. "Satisfied? This is what decisive leadership looks like." Silas nodded beside him, rehearsed confidence settling easily into place. They spoke about control while standing on something unstable. I said nothing. I took notes. I let the room celebrate a solution that solved only the problem they could see. Sarcasm stayed internal. Waiting was more useful. The rollout moved fast. Too fast. Corners were cut under the banner of momentum. Safeguards became optional. Every shortcut shaved time and added risk. Engineers exchanged looks but followed orders. Confidence has gravity. It pulls people along. Then the emails started. Compliance wanted documentation, audit trails, approval histories, version sign-offs, routine requests, polite in tone, impossible in substance. I watched leadership scramble quietly, asking questions no one could answer without opening doors best left closed. I stayed silent. Silence. Again. Did the work. By the end of the week, meetings multiplied. Hallway conversations lowered in volume. The product was live. The market convinced. And the paperwork incomplete. The system hadn't failed yet. It didn't need to. Confidence had been shipped. And somewhere inside the company, compliance was still waiting for documents that had never existed. That gap was where consequences always began for them. I knew it was coming before the badge reader flashed red. I tried again. Slower. As if patience might change policy. It didn't. Security didn't raise their voices. They never do. A quiet email arrived while I stood there, access suspended. Effective immediately. Another followed. Colder. Final. Inside. Alaric Boone was already satisfied. Removing me looked like decisiveness. The problem had been isolated. Meetings resumed without my name. Systems were someone else's responsibility now. He believed silence meant resolution. I walked out without resistance. Not because I had none, but because resistance would have been performative. Silence preserved options. By the afternoon, my calendar was empty, my inbox polite and distant. I was no longer inside the machine I built. And that absence was the point. Silas found me that evening. He didn't start with apology. He started with concern. Carefully measured. "You went too far," he said, "but it doesn't have to end badly." He framed it like protection, like mercy. "If you hand over the remaining source access, I can keep you safe. Father doesn't need to know." I listened. Still, he talked about marriage, stability, how this could all disappear if I stopped fighting. His voice never cracked. He believed he was offering me an exit. I asked what safety meant. He didn't answer directly. He didn't have to. Safety meant quiet. Ownership transferred. History rewritten. I reached into my bag and placed a drive on the table between us. Small, unremarkable. He relaxed when he saw it. Relief breaking through control. "You're doing the right thing," he said. I nodded once. The data on that drive was real, formatted correctly, and completely useless without what it referenced. Silas didn't know that yet. He took it, already planning explanations. I watched him leave with confidence he hadn't earned. Silence returned. Heavier now, behind it. The system was already responding. It adjusted quietly, reallocating load, flagging dependencies, recording every change, waiting patiently for the moment when confidence collapsed under documentation, timelines, and consequences no one in that house could talk their way out of without destroying themselves entirely. I wasn't inside the building anymore, but that made the view clearer. While leadership argued over optics and market sentiment, I focused on numbers no one was presenting. Debt doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in footnotes, schedules, covenants people skim when stock prices are still moving. The company was bleeding confidence, not cash. To fix that, they watched the share price obsessively, issuing reassurances, buying time. I used that time differently. I called contacts who never appear in press releases. I reviewed bond issuances, short-term notes, emergency credit lines activated during the rollout. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just obligations waiting for someone patient enough to collect them. I moved slowly and separately. One tranche through a fund that owed me a favor. Another through an intermediary who didn't ask why I wanted exposure instead of upside. Each purchase was small enough to avoid notice. Together, they formed a pattern no one was tracking because no one wanted to admit how fragile the structure had become. Inside Boone Industries, meetings multiplied. Outside, paperwork moved. Finance teams chased liquidity. Lawyers rewrote language. I stayed invisible, letting the chaos provide cover. Stocks tell stories people want to hear. Debt tells the truth whether they listen or not. By the time Alaric started demanding loyalty instead of answers, the groundwork was done. Silas was busy managing narratives, not numbers. No one asked who was holding the obligations keeping the lights on. They assumed friendly institutions. They assumed stability. What they missed was intent. Debt isn't ownership, but it outranks pride. It doesn't care about titles or family names. It only cares about terms, timing, and enforcement. I wasn't buying influence. I was buying inevitability. When the last document cleared, nothing changed on the surface. The company still stood. The market still believed. Inside the structure. However, every critical obligation now pointed to me. I didn't announce it. Predators don't. They wait. By the time anyone thought to look away from the stock ticker and into the balance sheet, Boone Industries no longer answered to the people who thought they were in control. I wasn't invited to the meeting, which made the hallway outside the boardroom louder than usual. Voices leaked through the glass, sharp and hurried, the sound people make when certainty starts slipping. I waited long enough to be noticed, then opened the door and stepped inside. The room froze. Alaric Boone sat at the head of the table, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. Across from him, Leonard Cross, interim chief financial officer, was already mid-sentence. He stopped when he saw me. Relief flickered. Then calculation. "We can't keep absorbing this," Leonard said quickly. "Recovering. If we don't act, the exposure becomes personal." He didn't look at Alaric when he said it. That was the tell. Someone was trying to survive. Alaric straightened. "This discussion is internal," he said. "She's no longer employed here, I'm aware," I replied. Calm enough to irritate him, I walked to the table and placed a thin folder at the center. The sound it made was small, deliberate. "I'm not here as staff." Board members exchanged glances. Silas stared at the folder like it might explode. Leonard leaned forward to spite himself. Alaric's voice hardened. "You don't have standing." "That depends," I said, sliding the document open. "On how you define obligation." Pages followed, clean and numbered. Debt instruments, notes, purchase confirmations. The math was simple, but the implications were not. Leonard read fast, color drained from his face. "This can't be right," he whispered. "It is," I said. "Every bridge loan, every emergency line, consolidated." I looked around the table. "You were watching the stock. I was reading the balance sheet." Alaric pushed back his chair. "This is manipulation," number one answered. It's arithmetic. Silence pressed down. No one reached for a pen. No one asked for a vote. I'm not here to vote, I said evenly. I'm here to collect. The room understood before Alaric did. And once it did, control shifted without a single hand raised. No objections followed. Only quiet recalculation. As men who ruled rooms realized power had already moved, and the meeting continued without Alaric giving another order or reclaiming control again. I called the debt at 9 the next morning. Calmly, without ceremony, notices went out in parallel. Contractual language doing what outrage never could. Payment demanded, covenants triggered, deadlines compressed. There was no announcement, no press, just math beginning to move. By the time the board reconvened, the room had changed. Alaric Boone arrived expecting arguments. He found numbers. His signature authority was frozen pending review. Banking access restricted. The chair at the head of the table suddenly looked decorative. You can't do this, he said. Standing. This company is mine. It was, I replied. Now it's obligated. Legal spoke before he could interrupt again, reading from documents he hadn't bothered to read before. Defaults, breaches, automatic controls, the kind of language that doesn't ask permission. Alaric reached for a pen and was told, politely, that he no longer had signing rights. Silas tried next. He always did. We can still fix this, he said. Eyes on me. Not the table. Let's slow down. We're family. Family doesn't suspend accounts, I said. Contracts do. His personal assets were already frozen, tied to guarantees he'd signed without understanding the downside. Board roles revoked. Access removed. The room didn't look at him when compliance confirmed it. Silence is efficient when everyone agrees. Alaric searched faces for loyalty and found calculation instead. Power drains quickly once it's measurable. He lowered himself back into his chair. Smaller now, reading outcomes instead of issuing orders. There was no vote, no dramatic motion, nothing to oppose. Control had shifted days earlier. Quietly, when obligations changed hands. This meeting was just the receipt. I'm calling the debt. I said again. Not louder, just final. Effective immediately. No one argued. They recalculated. That was the explosion. Cold, contained, irreversible. A boon was removed without a gavel. Without applause. Without a single hand raised. Because authority doesn't survive once it's outnumbered by consequences. They understood then that legacy meant nothing without leverage. That power fades fastest when exposed to daylight. And that my silence had never been surrender. Only timing, precision, and patience, waiting until mistakes finished speaking alone. I did not take the CEO chair when it was offered. Power that needs a throne is already unstable. Instead, I dismantled the structure that had protected it, piece by piece, quietly, without ceremony. Departments were separated. Authority was redistributed to the engineers, operators, and analysts who had carried the company while being ignored. Decisions moved closer to the work. Not the name on the door, no speeches, no celebration, just signatures and relief. The Boone Empire didn't collapse publicly. It dissolved. Contracts ended. Titles expired. Influence evaporated once it had nothing left to stand on. Silence replaced fear. And silence was enough. Justice arrived quietly, without witnesses, because fairness works best when ego is no longer present there. I walked away without legacy or credit, because liberation doesn't need applause. It needs closure. Alaric Boone called me useless, so I removed the system that ever made him feel powerful. What this story taught me isn't about revenge or winning. It's about recognition, knowing when silence is being used to shrink you. And when silence is the strongest answer you have, real power doesn't shout. It observes, measures, and waits for the moment when truth no longer needs permission to speak. I learned that fairness isn't always loud or immediate. Sometimes justice shows up quietly, through contracts, through systems, through decisions made long before anyone realizes they matter. Emotionally, the hardest part wasn't being insulted or pushed aside. It was realizing how easily people accept injustice when it benefits them. That moment forces a choice: do you disappear? Or do you stay steady and act with clarity? There's a human lesson here, too. Dignity doesn't come from titles, approval, or family names. It comes from knowing your value even when others try to rewrite it. And when you act from that place, you don't just protect yourself, you create space for others who are still afraid to speak up. If you were in my position, what would you do? Would you confront, comply, or quietly prepare? Take a second and think about that. By the way, where are you listening from right now? I'd genuinely love to know. If this story resonated with you, your support matters more than you think. One subscription helps this story reach someone who needs courage today. One like or share might shift how someone sees their own situation. When you subscribe, comment, or share, you're not just supporting this channel, you're helping stories like this give strength to people who need it. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.